Someone stood up in an audience somewhere and said to you, how do you be successful? Mm-hmm. And you said you have to be undeniably good at something.
Well, it really is this. When people ask me, say, how do you make it in show business or whatever? And what I always tell them, I've said it many years, and nobody ever takes note of it because it's not the answer they wanted to hear. What they want to hear is, here's how you get an agent, here's how you write a script, here's how you do this, But I always say, be so good they can't ignore you. And I just think that if somebody's thinking, how can I be really good? People are going to come to you. It's much easier than doing it that way than going to cocktail parties.
Hey, my name's Aaron, one of the pastors here at Bay Area. We are so glad that you're with us today. Thank you for joining us, wherever you're joining us from, Odenton Chapel, Annapolis Auditorium. It's just an honor to be together today. I'm excited to be jumping back into our series in 1 Peter. But Steve Martin, man, decorated entertainer, has been nominated for like everything ever, accomplished a lot, and that is his career advice that we just heard there from an interview from many years ago. His advice is to be so good they can't ignore you. Be so good they can't ignore you. That advice was picked up by Cal Newport, a writer who wrote a book that he ended up entitling that based on this interview. So good they can't ignore you, why skills trump passion in the quest for work that you love. And the idea behind this book is that if you want success in your work, if you want to love it, don't follow your passions. The key is to develop a rare and valuable skill, and then get that skill so honed that you are able to, by virtue of that skill, create opportunities. You don't have to sell yourself. You've already convinced them before you walk in the room because your skills are so good they can't be ignored. Be so good they can't ignore you. But an interesting thing is, I think that strategy is almost identical to what the Apostle Peter's strategy was for living in the midst of an antagonistic, anti-Jesus culture. That's almost exactly the same as his strategy. We're returning to the letter of 1 Peter, and I think if you were to boil down the main point of the section we're going to look at today, 1 Peter 2, verses 11 and 12, what you're going to see is that he's arguing that in the midst of a hostile culture where you don't belong, where your faith ultimately hurts your ability to advance, the best strategy for relating to a culture like that is to basically be so good they can't ignore you. Let me explain what I mean here, okay? Peter is writing this letter to a group of his friends that are living in Asia Minor. That's modern-day Turkey. These are mostly Gentile believers, meaning that they are not Jewish. They're at the front end of what is going to be some very intense persecution. It's just getting started. And so this letter, in many ways, Peter's writing to them as a treatise on how to suffer for your faith. How to suffer for your faith. How do you do that in a way that ultimately will bring glory to God? And he wants to provide them with a model. He knows that they have persecution, that more is coming, and he wants to give them a sense of how to do this properly. And if you've tracked with us over the last month, you know that we've been in our Souls season where we talk about a global missions emphasis. And our theme was the idea that we have a faith that is built to withstand persecution. And we looked at that both globally and locally. Our faith was built to withstand. And so you'll see why we chose 1 Peter. Knowing that theme was coming, we chose 1 Peter as the letter to explore in this part of the year. Because it's the best place to go in the New Testament. If you want to know how to suffer for your faith, this is the letter where you're going to want to go. And I really believe that there's a good reason for every American Christian in particular to do some heart work and to lay the foundation of preparation for a day when our faith is going to cost us something in a way that frankly it hasn't in the past. We've not had to think this way, but I think we need to because persecution isn't just a reality for someone out there somewhere. I think we need to prepare mentally and spiritually for societal pressure to increase right here at home. So let me remind you what we've covered so far in the letter of 1 Peter, kind of zooming back to the month of January where we were talking about this. It starts off in the beginning of the letter with a section about what is true. He zeroes in on the fact that suffering is happening, yes, and it will continue, but you have an incredible salvation. The fact that they have an inheritance that is incorruptible, undefiled, waiting in heaven for them, that they've been given a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That's what's true. And so then he transitions to what they ought to do. We spent 2 weeks talking about the how-to guide for sufferers. There are 5 commands that we went over in that section that they needed to do as a result of what's true. But Peter can't stop talking about the gospel, so he circles back to another section about what's true, recognizing that though you're going to be rejected, you have an identity. You can look past their rejection to your ultimate vindication by God, that you're a chosen people, a holy nation, a priesthood. And that will ultimately fuel your proclamation of the gospel. So that's 1 Peter 1:1 through chapter 2, verse 10. And then over the last month, as we did our soul season, both Sean and Greg jumped ahead in the letter to help us see how this relates specifically to suffering. But we're coming back, picking it off right where we left it, chapter 2, verse 11. What's going on in this section? Well, what's happening is that this verse represents a pretty significant shift in the letter. To this point, he's been explaining how they ought to handle their life inside of the Christian community as they interact with each other. But starting now, and for the rest of the letter, he's transitioning to talk about how to handle their life outside of the Christian community. In other words, how to live your life as an exile. How do you live your life as an exile? So let me give you an outline for where we're going to be for the next couple of weeks for this section of 1 Peter. It starts with this thesis statement, which is where we'll be today in chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. And he's going to give them a principle for how to be an exile. And then he applies that principle to 3 separate arenas or case studies in our life. What do we do about this truth in relationship to the government? What about in the workplace? What about in the home? And so we're going to go over those over the next 2 weeks. I really encourage you to come back, maybe even read ahead. It gets a little spicy, so it should be interesting. I'm excited about that, I think. But today, we just really want to drill down on the main point that he's trying to build throughout this section, which is the thesis statement in chapter 2, verse 11 and 12. How do we live as exiles? How do I practically function in this society? And the answer that he gives in verse 11 and 12 could be summarized, I think, this way. It's as simple as, be so good they can't ignore you. Or maybe more specifically, I think he's saying, be so good they can't ignore him. What do I mean by this? Be so good. By this, I don't mean job skills. I mean morally upright. Be so good that they can't ignore him. By him, I mean Jesus. As exiles, we need to be so good they can't ignore him. Peter's philosophy for how to live inside of a society that has turned against you is this: no matter what they do to you, no matter how they treat you, be so good they can't miss Jesus. Let me show you what I mean. We're looking at 1 Peter 2, 11 and 12. It says this: Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. Why? So that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. I think what he's laying out in these 2 verses is a 2-part strategy for how to live as an exile. There's 2 components. In verse 11, he talks about the fact that there's an internal component. In verse 12, he shifts to the external component. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are things that we need to do inside of us, decisions we're making internally that will have an impact on the outside of us. Work we do in our hearts that produces results in our behavior and in our relationship. Internal work that has external results in the people around us. So that's what he's going to be laying out in verse 11 and 12. Let's start out in verse 11 and look at this first part of the internal component of the strategy. Verse 11, here's what he says. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. He starts off this verse, and this might seem small, but he's appealing to their identity as he gives this first instruction. What he's saying is he's calling them sojourners and exiles. He's re-emphasizing the truth that who you are impacts how you are in the world. Who you are impacts how you are in the world. Who are they? He's saying you are sojourners and exiles. He wants them to embrace that as their actual identity walking around in the world. You are sojourners and exiles. What are those? That's a type of person who find themselves temporarily living in a place that is not their home. Okay, they don't belong there. For his audience in Asia Minor, he's not specifically talking about their actual citizenship in the towns that they are living in. He's talking about the fact that spiritually speaking, this world is not their home. They are just passing through, sojourners and exiles. And I think he intentionally kicks off this new section by identifying them in this very specific way because he wants them to own it, to take it on as their label. It's who you are. And so when we think about this strategy, the first component of the internal strategy, the step that they need to take if this strategy is going to work, is that they need to think like an exile. They need to think like an exile. That's part of the internal work. What does that mean practically? Well, I guess I'd say it this way, that it means that you can apply for a travel visa to here on earth, but you can't apply for citizenship. Okay? You're not building a forever home here. You're living out of your suitcase. The smells should be a little weird. The food isn't quite right. The language is a little bit confusing. Right? A native is someone who intuitively thinks like people who are from there. Right? If you are a native Annapolitan, you just like come out knowing how to sail and loving crabs. I don't know. Like, if you're born at AAMC, I'm just pretty sure it happens, which our youngest was, so I'm not sure how to help him because I'm not from here, which means I'll let you figure out the end of that sentence, but I'm going to say it out loud in Maryland. But I'm not from here. Okay? If you're native, you get the nativeness. But if you're not from here, then here always feels a little bit off, right? My wife and I have gotten to travel a little bit over the years and see some cool places. We're blessed by that. We've gotten to go to Israel a couple of times. We've been to South Africa. We've been to Aruba. We've been to Baltimore. It's like, some cool places. But, beautiful people, incredible cultures, very cool food, lots of beautiful things to see. It's awesome. But eventually, if you're like me, maybe you've even been on a short-term trip, you feel these things. I start feeling that pull toward home, right? You start feeling that. And there's a moment that I look forward to as you're coming back into the States, you're going through all the rigmarole to re-enter. And at some point, if you're not using the automated thing, somebody's going to look at your passport picture and then look at you. Mine was taken when I was like 4 years old. They're like, what in the world? But anyway, they look at that passport photo and sometimes they'll say something like, welcome home, Mr. Hickson. Or like, welcome to the United States. And every time I'm like, thank you. Oh my goodness, thank you. Or the other thing I want to do is turn around, like take my passport and be like, USA, USA, to like the rest of the crowd. They're like, sir, you've been in Canada for less than 24 hours. I don't understand. This is a lot for what's going on. But the point is, no matter how nice another country is, no matter how nice your stay there was, there's no place like home, right? You feel a little off until you get back to the place where you feel like you truly belong. Our life is supposed to feel like that. For the follower of Christ, no matter how much you love the country you get to live in, or your own life, or the home that God has blessed you with, or your bed, the fact is, we're just passing through. We need to think like exiles. And I think so many of the problems that we experience as Christians in America today in particular stem from the fact that at times, I think we've lost this exilic mentality. Because followers of Jesus in every culture and for all of time have always had to live in this tension of being in their culture, yes, but not of their culture. Of course, I want to be for my culture and my country, but I'm not ultimately from it. We got to live inside of that tension. We are first and foremost, primarily and ultimately, citizens of another kingdom. And the moment that we lose sight of that fact, we get a little too cozy inside of our current citizenship. And when that happens, something always gets out of alignment in our priorities. Here in America, historically, our expectations of what it feels like to be a follower of Christ have been shaped by being in the majority. Look, that's a blessing. I think it's a grace. I think it's good for human flourishing. But it has a potential downside. It creates the opportunity for wrong thinking. And I'll say, at least for myself, I have fallen prey to that at times. I think maybe we all have. And there are two opposite errors that we can make in conceptualizing our life here on earth and staying on the path that God has called us in. And I want to explain it to you with a little graphic, and I made it this week, and you're going to act like it's impressive, okay? So the first mistake we can make and kind of end up on the ditch on one side of the road is that we can think about our life as something that we merely have to endure. We just have to endure it. That's what life is. We just try to get to heaven. And what this does, this way of thinking, leads us to the imbalance where we don't prioritize actual people's needs, especially when it comes to the alleviation of suffering or injustice. Look, it's all going to burn anyway, right? Just endure. That's one way we can go wrong. But the opposite mistake on the other side of the road, the other ditch, would be to overly embrace our life, where this is as good as it's ever going to get. So we get too comfy, too cozy, and we put down such deep roots that the loss of any creature comfort at all feels like the end of the world, that God's abandoned us because I'm less comfortable than I was previously. But neither one of these are the proper way for a follower of Jesus to conceptualize our life. And I'm concerned that our long-held position in the majority has created the possibility of becoming a little too comfortable. If you're in deep persecution, at least my tendency would just be to kind of grit my teeth and sort of get through it, to just endure. But if you're too comfortable, the temptation would be to mistake your comfort for God's favor. They're not the same. And when we do that, we become obsessed with protecting our own rights more than honoring the name of Christ. That's why I think the middle ground that Peter's calling them to is not to endure or to embrace, it's exile, a mentality of exile. A focused pursuit of Jesus that's grounded in your actual life here on this planet, that's fine, but without losing sight of the fact that we're in exile and we're just passing through. We have to think like an exile. And that's the first part of the internal strategy that Peter is giving them. But there's a second component of this internal strategy, and we see it in the verse. He says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles," what does he want them to do? To abstain from the passions of the flesh. What's he saying here? Well, the flesh, that's just our sin nature. That's the part of all of us that wants to do what's wrong. And he's saying, don't give in. We've all got desires to do the wrong thing. Don't do that. And then he adds this interesting line. He says, abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. He says, your sinful nature that we all have, that is warring against you. You are being actively attacked by an enemy, and you've got to fight back as if you're on a battlefield. If the first part of the strategy is to think like an exile, the second part of the strategy is to never forget the war. Never forget the war. If they're going to make it inside of an antagonistic culture, they can never forget, even for one moment, that they are at war. Imagine how devastating it would be for a soldier to forget that they're in a battle while being in the middle of a battle, right? You've got no shot in that scenario. If you conceptualize your life as like a frolicking stroll through a field of lilies, holding the hand of your best friend and humming a happy tune, but it turns out you're at the tactical center of an exchange of gunfire, you're toast, right? You've got no chance. You've got to realize this is a war zone. If you do, you'll think differently, you'll pack differently, you'll eat differently, you'll sleep differently. You're in exile, and this is war. But notice something. Did you notice who the enemy is? Who's waging war? It's the passions of the flesh that are at war. The enemy is in you. The enemy is not the surrounding culture. It's not the political system. It's not your jerk boss who hates your faith. No, the enemy is the passions of your flesh. He wants them to take our own sin seriously enough that we kill it, and then we stand over the body and make sure it doesn't move. There's an internal component. We need to think like an exile, and we need to never forget the war. And he's talking about the war within. The internal strategy is all about personal discipline, a life of godliness, fueled by God's grace. But why would that be the case? Like, how would this help them as they're interacting with the culture? Well, this is where he turns next. He turns to the external part of the strategy. As you're doing this internal stuff, think like an exile, never forget the war. What's your posture toward the watching world? We see that in verse 12. He says, as you're doing this stuff, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. Why? So that when they speak against you as evildoers, they'll see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. As God transforms you from the inside, it will impact your public persona. His transforming work from the inside will enable you to keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. This is so interesting because what he doesn't say is become really, really godly on the inside and then just kind of stow away. Become like a sleeper cell over here in the culture. Nobody sees you. Against the big bad world out there. Form a little side club. We got handshakes and signs in order to get into the door. And where we hate on all the sinful people out there, the people that we don't like. And then we're going to wage war from this position of defensiveness and go out against the oppressive people. Start a revolution. No, that's not what he says. He says wage war, yeah, but it's against your own sin. And then let your public demeanor, let your customer-facing presentation be that of conduct that is honorable, unimpeachable. And I love this. He says it's among the Gentiles. Let your conduct among the Gentiles. I think that's interesting because he's writing to people who are mostly Gentiles, right? They're not Jewish. But he's using this term Gentile in the spiritual sense. Gentiles are people who are of this world, people out there. They're natural-born citizens of this world. But that's not you. You're not a Gentile. You're an exile. You're not a Gentile. You're an exile. And you're supposed to live an exemplary life in front of the natives out there. Why? Well, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they'll see your good deeds and glorify God. That's why. He's acknowledging they're going to speak evil against you. He's assuming they will continue to malign you. They're convinced that you're wrong, that you're bad for society, that you're bigoted, that you're not going to get with the program. They will speak evil against you. But your goal is to be so godly in the midst of this bad treatment, in the midst of it, that they can't help but see your good deeds. They can't help it. Notice a couple things. He says this phrase, the day of visitation, that's talking about the fact that these people would come to place their faith in Christ so that they can long for the day when Jesus returns. When he comes back, it'll be a good day for them because they've placed their faith in Christ. So that's what's coming. But he also says, interestingly, when they see your good deeds. I think that's intriguing because in order for that to make sense, we have to be actually interacting with the culture, right? Our actual actions in real life in the world have to be tangibly dripping with the difference that Jesus has made in our lives. He doesn't say when they see your beliefs page on the website or when they read your public statement to the press. Our actual lives have to point people to changed hearts that are so radically changed that only Jesus could do this kind of work. So on fire with a godly life that even their haters are taking an interest in what's going on. That's the whole point, by the way, of good works. Our good works are not an arbitrary badge of honor to somehow earn favor with God. That is totally backwards. Because of the gospel, Jesus' death in our place, his resurrection, offering to us new life, good deeds bubble out of the work he's already done in us in order to point people back to more Jesus. You can't earn relationship with God. You demonstrate it by faith as we produce good works. The looking world is amazed, the watching world. We're inviting other people to experience the same transformation that we have when they see your good deeds. I think it's also interesting that he says, when they speak against you, when they speak against you. He doesn't say attack you. He says speak evil. I think that's something of a hint that at the moment, the intensity of the persecution for them was at that level. They were more likely to be mocked than massacred at this moment. It's going to get worse. Greg talked about that last week. It will get much worse. But the day-to-day for these people, as they receive this letter, I think looks a lot like a follower of Christ in today's culture in some places. There is a social and cultural cost to being associated with a belief system as exclusive as faith in Jesus. There's a cost. Socially, culturally. That's what these people are experiencing. That's very parallel to us today. Let's review what he's saying. Internally, externally, he's saying, do these things, think like an exile, never forget the war, and do them so well, such that externally, what's the result? It's that salvation is more believable than slander. Salvation is more believable than slander. He's assuming you will be slandered. They're not going to let you off about this. But he wants them to be so godly that none of it sticks. right? Nobody buys that slander. It's obviously false. Anybody who's known you for more than a couple of minutes is going to be like, I don't know, that just doesn't sound like them. But if a rumor got started, they're like, I don't know, anybody who hangs out with this lady ends up believing in Jesus. It's kind of crazy. Like, I don't know, it seems like anybody who hangs out with him eventually, they're like believing in like people coming back to life. It's like kind of strange, right? That's, people have like, they hear that rumor, they're like, oh yeah, that checks out. I've been around them, I know what that's like, yeah. Salvation, that's believable. I'm not buying the slander. Salvation is more believable than slander as people watch not just the way we treat each other, but specifically the way we treat our enemies as they're in the act of abusing us. Our character speaks for itself. How could they possibly live a life like that? The only way would be is if they have an exilic mindset. This world's not my home. That I'm at war, but it's with my own sin, such that I never, when reviled, I don't revile in return. And when that happens, salvation is more believable than slander. If that happens, they would be so transformed that I believe that they could become so good that they can't ignore Jesus. So good they can't ignore him. The marching orders, the strategy that he's laying out for followers of Jesus is to be so dripping with God's grace that your life is unignorable. So morally upright, the culture can't ignore your Savior. I love this quote. It's from Alexander MacLaren, Scottish preacher, 150 years ago. He said it this way. He said, "The world takes its notions of God, most of all, from the people who say that they belong to God's family." Keep this in mind, it's 150 years ago. He says this, "They read us a great deal more than they read the Bible." If that was true then, I think it's true now. They read us a great deal more than they read the Bible. They see us. They only hear about Jesus Christ. That's true. And that's why I believe it's so important, why Peter's message was so clear, that we need to, as exiles, be so good they can't ignore Jesus. And the amazing thing is, in the first century, that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what happened. Christianity goes from being this like weird offshoot of Judaism, like a sect that we can't really understand and that people were confused by, to being the main religion of the Roman Empire in less than 300 years. And that was due in large part to the fact that despite the persecution, despite the marginalization, despite the societal pressure, Christianity, followers of Jesus, little Christs, became synonymous with help for the poor, of the adoption of unwanted and abandoned children, of medical care for the dying, no matter what it was putting them at risk in the midst of doing it, of humility and kindness and gentleness and a belief that you could be forgiven for your sins with nothing that you do and earn, but by the free gift of grace. That message turned the world upside down. When Christians were marginalized and ridiculed and martyred, they remained so good. Their message couldn't be ignored. It wasn't ignored, and it's why we're here today. So what does this mean for us? I have a lot of thoughts here, but over the next couple of weeks, we're going to look at what it looks like in these three areas in particular. If that's our calling, that no matter what they throw at us, we're so good they can't ignore Jesus. What does that look like if the government's hostile? What does that look like if the workplace is hostile? What does that look like in the family? This gets really interesting, and we'll dig down really into the specifics of our life. And we might not always agree about what all of this looks like. But for now, before we jump into those, I just want us to embrace the idea that this is our calling, to be so good they can't ignore us. How do we do it? Well, we need to embrace this internal and external dynamic. We need to begin with thinking the way that Peter called us to think so that we can have the effect that Peter wanted them to have. Because this verse ends up reading more like a prophecy as you look back in history than it does like a command. It reads more like a prophecy. He told them to do it. They did it. It became true. So what about us? I think whether or not you have yet experienced the subtle to the significant in terms of cultural marginalization? I believe that we will. And we need to be increasingly prepared for that. So what does an exilic mentality look like for us? Well, for me, I mean, this could be silly, but this is something that I'm thinking through even in our own life, of raising kids and the intensity of that, and, trying to maintain our home, and things go wrong there, and you're trying to work through the details, and, call the county, and then we got to fill out this form, and what are the kids doing, and did they get their shots, and are we doing sports, and do we get that thing scheduled for the summer, and are we going on vacation, and where's the groceries? In just living life, it can be more, my day-to-day efforts can become so fixated on just getting through the day, just becoming a little more comfortable, just adding a little bit of value to our home, just having a little bit more fun, that the higher calling that I've been called to is just ignored. Not with wrong stuff, not with sinful stuff, just stuff of the natives, stuff of life on earth. And I think for me, just recognizing that some of the things in my life will not be quite as dialed in as I'd like them to be if I'm in exile. Because it means I'm not really expecting or even attempting to create my best life now. I'm just not. If you're thinking like an exile. You're thinking about what God's called you to, the impact your life could have on your neighbors, a willingness that even when work gets intense, even when the jokes start coming, that to see God's called me to something bigger than just now. I think like an exile. And I think when we do, that creates a couple of things. It creates urgency, first of all, that I've got a job to do, that God's left me here for a reason, and the reason is not to get more cozy. It's not just to put down the world's deepest roots. It's to be at work in the things he's called me to. So it creates urgency. It also kind of creates a little bit more resiliency. Because when things do go wrong and I'm not as comfortable as I want to be, I'm not offended at the concept that I might have to go through something difficult. Of course I would. I'm an exile. This world's not my home. The food doesn't taste right. The bed doesn't feel right. It's not right because it's not home. Think like an exile. Also, I know for me, never forgetting the war is a big deal. When it comes down to it, I don't mind going to war just with basically anybody but me. I don't want to go over my own issues. It's the people and what they said to me. And if you just knew the context and how she's been treating me lately and the way that my boss talks to me and the things that they make me do, if you just knew, I'd be justified in pushing back and fighting back and standing up for myself. The war is against our own sin. I can't control the culture, but by God's grace, I can make war with my own sin. Sean, a couple of weeks ago, asked the question, does our life invoke a question? When people interact with us, again, work, school, family, when they interact with us, does it make them ask anything? Or do they just walk away and our lives made no impact? Do they ask any questions? And if they do ask a question, what kind of question is it? Is it, who died and made him king? Or is it, why are they so nice again? Why is it that you just can't get under their skin? Why are they doing that with their money again? Try to remind me why they spend their vacations in that country. Those are the kind of questions that our life should be invoking. Such that salvation is more believable than slander. When we get the internals right, when we're thinking the right way, pursuing the things God's called us to by his grace, the external results come. But the fact is, this is not a do more, try harder mentality. That somehow the weight of the world is on each of us as Christians. And if you don't get it right in your neighborhood, then the whole operation falls apart. Christ can't build his church if we aren't perfect. Right? It's not that at all. I mean, history is replete with examples of people who have worn the name of Christ, utterly failed, and his church moved on. Because he's the one building his church. We don't have to be perfect. We're depending on his grace. All of the work is done by the power of the gospel because Jesus has already overcome the world. He has already won the war with our sin. He took all of our shame, all of our slander. He took it to the cross. And when he was reviled, he did not revile in return. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And our sin was placed on him. The innocent one was punished for us. And he did not fight it. He did not push back. He did not stand up for his rights. He took the punishment. and has overcome the world, so that we can live godly lives, so that we can see people come to faith in him, so that we can get over it when our coworkers and our neighbors and our family think it's weird, the whole faith thing, and our strange convictions that don't align with the morals of our day, and when the pressure mounts and the jokes come because they will, and when the invites don't come, which they probably have already started not coming, when the embarrassment kicks in, we can simply pray for the strength to be so good that if nothing else, they won't miss Jesus. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, this is a high calling. And as we explore what it looks like over the next couple of weeks, we've got a lot of work to do. I pray that you'd prepare our hearts, but I pray now that this message would sink deep. The idea that what you're calling us to is to a life beyond this one, to a mission that matters more than this moment, to a mentality of warfare against our own sin by your grace, so that when the world comes after these convictions, this claim that only you are Lord, that our response would simply be to trust you with whatever difficulty it brings. Pray that we could be, Lord, so good they can't ignore you. Amen. Hopefully, you're able to join us over the next couple of weeks. I really urge you to be there. I think we have a lot of important things to work through as all of us have our worldview shaped and challenged by this section of 1 Peter. So thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week.